I'm Michael Krasny, welcoming you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly global podcast where we do deep dive interviews each week with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists and entertainers, scientists and opinion shapers, and we take pride in covering a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely topics and issues distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. And we invite you to join us with your questions and comments and to join our podcast community by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. In this episode, we talk with entrepreneur, author, and media figure and Silicon Valley pundit Andrew Keen of the History podcast, Keen On, and also Keen On Substack, which you can subscribe to and become a member of. And he's also best known as a commentator of the digital revolution, and he has served as executive director of Silicon Valley Future Cast and is the author of The Cult of the Amateur, Digital Vertigo, The Internet is Not the Answer, How to Fix the Future, and Tomorrow's versus Yesterday's. Andrew was born in London, educated at the University of London, the University of Sarajevo, and the University of California at Berkeley. I want to welcome all of you who are joining us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny Live, and welcome Andrew Keen.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's a real honor to be on your show. Long-time listener. You're a legend.
That's a word I reject, but I thank you for the sentiment. And let's talk about your legendary punditry, because it's certainly well known to many throughout the world. And here we have a breaking news story. 34 counts, former President of the United States, Trump, found guilty on 34 counts. The sentencing will be on July 11th, but he called it a disgrace. I want to get your thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, we've all obviously got complicated thoughts on this, Michael. My sense is it's still part of the, I wouldn't call it a conventional narrative, but the orthodox narrative of the soap opera, of the daily soap opera, in which the American president or a wannabe president will probably end up in jail or somehow associated with the courts whilst he's in office. So rather than the internet, we can go back to television, soap opera, reality television to make sense of this. I don't know who's writing the script, Michael, but there's still a lot of episodes to go. There's still a lot of mileage in this narrative.
Well, it can't be predicted, and yet at the same time, that image is one that you put of the president, this particular past president, in jail, is one that many people find delectable. And yet, as an American-born, I keep thinking about the office of the presidency and what it does to sully it and bring it into a kind of disgrace. We haven't had anything like this since Eugene Debs, who was just a candidate and was in prison while he was campaigning.
Yeah, and Eugene Debs shouldn't have been in prison. And of course, when he was let out, I think it was Coolidge, a Republican president, had the generosity to invite him to the White House. I think comparing and contrasting Donald Trump and Eugene Debs is an interesting one. I'm not sure I would necessarily agree with you. I think Richard Nixon was guilty of equally disturbing charges. He was lucky to stay out of jail. Bill Clinton as well was a very controversial president. So I'm not convinced this is that unusual. Perhaps our coverage, our understanding of it is, but it's not an extraordinary development.
I'd agree with you on that. But
perhaps maybe let me revise that, Michael. The extraordinary is ordinary in American politics, so it doesn't surprise me.
That's a nice way to phrase it. I was thinking also of the other cases that are pending and that will go into the post-election with respect to the sullying and disgrace of the presidency. But you're quite right. Clinton and Nixon had that similar effect. What does it say about democracy, though? I mean, you did all these podcasts on democracy, and I wonder how it stands out in your mind, especially with Biden trying to make that the centerpiece of the campaign, the survival of democracy.
I'm the wannabe Michael Krasny on my How to Fix Democracy show, so it's not so much my job to articulate what I think. I tend to be a little less pessimistic and perhaps hysterical about American democracy than many of my guests. It's not par for the course what's happening with Trump. It is unusual, entertaining, and troubling. But I don't believe that even in the worst case scenario, American democracy is in existential crisis. I think if Trump is elected, which isn't inconceivable in November, he might try to undermine some of the legal aspects of American democracy. But it's hard to imagine that he's going to shut the whole thing down. I think the most worrying thing is if he's elected, the chances of there being urban violence in places like New York and Oakland, Philadelphia, St. Louis aren't that unlikely. And that would give him the excuse to impose some sort of martial law.
And if he's not elected, there would be.
Well, if he's not elected, I think he's done. I mean, unless it's again another bizarrely close election determined by a few hundred or a few thousand votes.
Oh, but you don't think he could incite violence like he is alleged to have done on January 6th?
Well, I did a debate a year or two ago in New York, the Intelligence Squared debate. I'm sure you're familiar with it. They do excellent debates about whether January 6th was an existential crisis for American democracy. And I don't think it was. I think it was a lot of overweight, bearded men come up from their cellars and run around, wave a few flags, and then go back to their cellars. Some of them ended up in jail. They had no coherent plan. There was no Lenin. There was no Caesar of the Winter Palace. So for me, again, it's January 6th was theater. The theater of the digital absurd, of people who had no idea what they were doing. I remember watching it on television. My son called me and said, "Do you know what's going on?" I switched CNN on. And it was bizarre. There was no threat. They had no plan. They sat in Nancy Pelosi's office. But they had no Leninist plot to seize control of the state. So for me, January 6th doesn't represent an existential crisis. It doesn't mean I'm a great admirer of these people. But the Proud Boys, in my mind, are little more than jokes. And when you go back to the 90s, for example, I did a show with a professor from a Texas university who just wrote a book about why the 90s matter. He reminded us that the right-wing violence of the 90s was much more disturbing than the January 6th people. There were mass murders, mass suicides, standoffs, military standoffs between the FBI and some of these right-wing fanatics hostile to the state, these hardcore libertarians. So I'm not even convinced that in the 20 years since the 1990s, this so-called right-wing plot against democracy has become more troubling. It's just perhaps because of the nature of our communications and the internet and X and Facebook and all the rest of it, TikTok, that this stuff seems more immediate and dramatic. Everything seems dramatic until 5 minutes afterwards, and then we forget it. That's the nature of digital time, I think. Everything seems a crisis, and then the next crisis comes along, or the next imagined crisis, and we forget the previous one.
But you can certainly stir up a lot through social media. I mean, that's what's happening now in the demonstrations that are going on in universities throughout the country, isn't it? I mean, a lot of it's stirred up by social media.
Yeah, although again, I'm as much a vocal critic of social media as anyone, and I think my 2011 book, Digital Vertigo, which was the least successful of my books because it was a bit early, was a warning about social media. So I'm no great fan of social media. But social media has also been instrumental in the Me Too movement, in the Black Lives Matter movement. And personally, I'm somewhat sympathetic to the students demonstrating about American complicity in Gaza. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
Well, since we're talking about digitalization and really your work as an author, and there are people already sending in questions for you, which is always a good sign.
I hope they're not bots, Michael.
Well, actually, one of the things I want to ask you about is that. But before I get to that, I'm wondering, are you still pretty much persistent with the kind of criticism that you became somewhat famous for, really, internationally? That is, taking on Web 2.0 and taking on the internet and thinking that we were all being really turned into sort of what we shouldn't be turned into by those hegemons.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit of a spoil sport. I'm a Trumpian narcissist in the sense that I enjoyed it when I was the only person out there making these warnings back in 2005 and 2006. And now everyone's saying what I said. I'm like a little bored with it. But I think it's true that the disintermediation of professionals like yourself, I mean, we're on the internet and you seem to be building a coherent business. But this kind of media experience of being interviewed by a credible person called Michael Krasny, who I know, who physically exists, who's not in the pay of the Russians or the Trumpians or the Saudis, I much prefer that to much of what's happening on the internet. So yeah, my views have become standard. My views have become the zeitgeist. When I was first critical, I mean, we don't even hear this term Web 2.0 anymore because we're onto Web 3 in the age of AI. But when I became critical of Web 2 in the mid 2000s, in the mid not 2000s, whatever you call them, around 2005, almost everybody was saying, oh, the internet's great. It democratizes media. There's going to be this long tail. Everyone will have a voice. Everyone will have a business model. The Michael Krasnys of the world, Thomas Frank, the Tom Friedman, all these, Maureen Dowd, you would be replaced by the democratic voice of the people. And that isn't what happened. It's harder and harder to make a living. It's a winner-take-all economy. And of course, the real winners in this economy are big tech companies like Google and Facebook, who have established in architecture of what one analyst called surveillance capitalism, where we're all watched all the time. Our data is being appropriated and sold, and we don't even benefit. So I haven't really changed. It's just that my argument that I put forward in The Cult of the Amateur, which at the time was seen as both reactionary and completely out on a limb, has now become mainstream.
It has, and there are many things I agree with, but you took a hell of a lot of criticism at the time, and there were people who were even, I would say, hostile, vicious. There was a lot of enmity.
Yeah.
You know, perhaps you're a follower of Nietzsche and think maybe that can make you stronger, and maybe it does, but I wonder how that all set with you at the time. I mean, I was looking at some of the criticisms, and they were vicious would not be too strong a word.
Yeah, I have to admit, I rather enjoyed it. You know, it's the old cliche that the worst thing to come out of a book is the absence of a reaction. So the fact that I riled so many people up was a good thing, and it created a debate. There are some people who were personally offended by being criticized. One who comes to mind is a very famous law professor called Larry Lessig, who was particularly offended with what I said. And ironically enough, when I wrote the book, most people hadn't heard of me. The book was distributed at one of the early TED conferences. Lessig picked the book up, saw that I'd criticized him, and then became obsessed with destroying my credibility and attacking the book. But of course, what he did was build my brand and create an enormous amount of interest in the book and in my ideas. And I've become successful because of that. So I have to thank guys like Larry Lessig for helping me.
Lawrence Lessig was a big name at the time. He was even considered.
He was a big name. I don't know is he still a big name? Would you have him on the show, Michael?
I don't think quite. I used to have him on, but at one time he was actually an aspiring presidential candidate. And I think he's not as necessarily in the news as much as he was back then by any stretch. But
I think some of these people really, another one who comes to mind is Chris Anderson, who was at the time the editor of Wired and the author of a book called The Long Tail. These people really discredited themselves and they've kind of disappeared off the scene. And critics of the internet, people like myself, Jaron Lanier, Sherry Turkle, I think we've been made more credible from the events over the last 25 years.
But there were those who were more credible who criticized you. For example, there was a woman who wrote in The Guardian, trying to recall her name, you may know it, but she said, if it weren't for the internet, I wouldn't have a career. And, it's a meritocracy, this internet that Andrew is condemning and so forth.
I don't know who was it? I bet she still hasn't got a job. Well, the interesting thing about The Guardian, Michael, is again, it was also always one of the most bullish newspapers on the internet about the potential of the digital revolution.
Hazel Baxter.
Oh, I don't know the name, but well, I'm not sure if we've heard of her since. That probably killed her career. But The Guardian isn't a real business because it's supported by a trust fund. It's the same with The Atlantic. You see The Atlantic now online, and they do a wonderful job. They sign up the best writers, but The Atlantic now, and I did an interview on Keen On with Rick MacArthur, the publisher of Harper's, about this. The Atlantic is financed by Steve Jobs' money that is his wife inherited. So she may not have had a job, but the Guardian still doesn't really have a business model. And that was my point, is that it's very hard to build businesses online. Now, I think one of the things that's changed since I wrote Call to the Amateur in 2007 is that the subscription model now is more viable. When I wrote that book back in 2007, the New York Times was free. I think the Wall Street Journal and the other Murdoch newspapers were just shifting over. The Washington Post was free. Now they've all built paywalls. And I think one of the problems with the intellectual euphoria of the Web 2.0 movement was that paying for media was somehow considered wrong, immoral, that it was taking advantage of people. And my argument was that you pay for a loaf of bread, you pay for your dinner, you pay for gas for your car, you pay your rent, you pay your mortgage. Why shouldn't you pay for content online? And most people, I think, or at least most media companies have come around to that. Now the most viable businesses online are companies like the New York Times. If you want to read the stuff, you pay for it. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing immoral. We shouldn't want to shame media companies for asking people to pay for content. Digital isn't free. It still costs them to employ guys like Michael Krasny. So, but meanwhile, The Guardian is still free. And I'm not sure of the long-term viability of a newspaper like that.
Let me go to a question for you from Olivia up in Seattle. She says, you were critical of Reid Hoffman and social media a decade ago and still seem to be today, yet you host a show on LinkedIn. Does that balance? I
don't host a show on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, and it happens to be distributed on it. I'm not really critical of Reid Hoffman. Actually, I admire the guy. I think of all the...
He's one of the good guys, really, isn't he?
Yeah, he is one of the good guys. I mean, personally, he's a very nice man. I wouldn't say I'm a friend, but I spent some time with him. My book, Digital Vertigo, was built out of a debate we did at Oxford about the value of social media. My guess is if we did that debate again, he would agree with me. I think that kind of criticism, though, Michael, I don't know the identity of the person making it, is one that I always hear. Oh, you're critical of the internet, and yet you have friends on the internet. That's not really an argument. It's the kind of thing you read on X or social media, and it's intellectually below the belt. It's not a coherent position. I never argued in any of my work that one shouldn't be on the internet. My background, as you said, is as an internet entrepreneur. I did my own startup in the 90s, Audio Cafe. I've never argued that we should be offline. If you could see my office from where I'm speaking, I'm surrounded with 3 or 4 different computers. I'm anything but a Luddite. There's no reason why one can't be critical of the business models of online companies and the increasing inequality between the super rich of Silicon Valley and everyone else, and at the same time still enjoy getting online and distributing your content online. Those two things are not in any way in conflict.
There was a lie and a fabrication, though, it came out of, and I had to encounter it in a lot of my broadcasts, that somehow we were all being connected in kumbaya and the internet was really creating a whole new, I don't know, halcyon world as opposed to a dystopia. I mean, it doesn't have to be those two extremes, admittedly, but there was a lot of that kind of almost propaganda, and people were standing behind it, and they were really quite adamant about it. You have a book titled The Internet is Not the Answer, and I remember thinking when I first saw that title, well, what is? And you have 5 suggestions, pretty good suggestions, general and sort of to be expected in many ways, but you also take us into some pretty, for most people, what would be arcane stuff, what's going on in Singapore, what's going on in Estonia. But there are examples out there of the answer to that question of what can we have in its stead.
Yeah, and in that book, The Internet's Not the Answer, there is a kind of meta theme in it, and I borrow from Thomas More's 16th century masterpiece, Utopia. the idea of human agency, and that's the core of this. But I talk about the need for regulation and education, the need for union organization, the need for moral responsibility of entrepreneurs. And I think that book came in about 2017, 2018, about 5 years ago. And those 5 or 6 themes have become more and more central. What I don't do in the book, though, is rely exclusively on regulation. I think that's problematic, because if you just want to regulate the internet out of existence, that's not good for the American economy. That's not good for innovation. So I think we need more responsible innovators. I'm not sure if we're seeing them now. And in fact, with someone like Sam Altman at OpenAI, who conforms to all the best and worst aspects of the brilliant Silicon Valley entrepreneur, I think we're seeing the same appearance of a market-based techno-utopianism within OpenAI and the AI movement. And you saw this play out, in fact, when Altman was pushed off the board and there was an attempt to strip him of the CEO title last year.
That failed ultimately.
It failed in a sense, but I think he's somewhat of a wounded animal now, Michael. He's not the old Altman, and I think more and more tech observers are suggesting that OpenAI is a very different company since Altman came back. So I think these issues are still central. There are no magic bullets. There are, of course, those who say, oh, all we need is new technology. We need Web3, a distributed network. We need Bitcoin. We need this or that. And new technology will solve all that. I think that just digs a deeper hole. We need a mix of things. And I think the historical approach...
Well, can you amplify a little bit on what you started to say about human agency and Sir Thomas More?
Well, I think More's book in the 16th century was written at a time of similarly dramatic technological upheaval, changes in economy, changes in the organization of society, changes in wealth and political power, which we're going through today, and the internet is both a cause and a consequence of. And in my interpretation of the book, which is a controversial book, divides people, I think he's suggesting that we have to have more agency. We have to control our world rather than the world controlling us. It's the first chapter of the book, and I think it still reads relatively freshly. Some of the rest of the book, obviously, is a little outdated now, but the stuff on Utopia, I was still really pleased I wrote.
And here's Barry from Green Bay, Wisconsin, says, how do you see the role of government regulation evolving in the tech industry over the next decade? You mentioned regulation, so let's go there.
I think there is a need for regulation. I mean, that goes without saying. You don't need me to tell you that. But I think government is slow and reactionary. And I'm fearful of the European model, where the only innovation in Europe seems to be stopping American tech companies, big tech companies, which I don't think benefits Europe and probably doesn't benefit the American economy. In that book, I spent some time with Margaret Vestager, who's the most influential and powerful European regulator. I think what she's doing, or what she has done, is a good thing, but I don't think that is the only way to push back on tech, particularly in the United States, where the state is weak, historically weak. And I think under Biden, the scorecard of the state in terms of regulating tech hasn't been particularly impressive. They've mostly failed. And meanwhile, the AI engine seems to be steaming forward completely unregulated. It's very, very hard. It's easy to talk about these things, but it's very, very hard to navigate between a pure free market where anyone can do anything, and you have an economy driven by guys like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, and on the other hand, a European-style system where government seems to regulate all innovations. So we need a middle ground. It's rather boring, but that's the nature of things.
Apropos question from Susan, and thank you for the questions that are coming in, all of you. Susan's with us from Portland, Oregon. She wants to know, how do you envision future work in the face of automation and AI?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question. I don't know what a bigger number is than trillion, but that's a wonderful question. It's something that everybody's giving huge amounts of thought to. Of course, like everybody, I think I'm ambivalent. On the one hand, we're all concerned about many jobs disappearing. On the other hand, I acknowledge the argument of technophiles or techno-optimists who say every wave of technological innovation results in the destruction of old jobs and the creation of new ones. It's just that we never quite know what the new ones are. And I think there's some truth to that. I've heard arguments, well, everyone's going to be masseurs or chefs or physical vinyl record DJs in the future, which is obviously absurd. What the most interesting thing for me, I think, in terms of the future of labor and work, is whether this AI revolution in the long term, and the long term means the rest of the 21st century, will result in the undermining of what we might think of as our technocratic elite of the industrial age, the lawyers, the doctors, who have run America, for better or worse, over the last 100 years. And I think that will probably happen over the long term. The question is who replaced them. Will they be tech titans like Reid Hoffman, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel? Will it be a new class of people? Will it be more democratic people? And of course, the other question is whether this technology, and this is the utopian strain in some people's thinking, Marx articulated this in the middle of the 19th century in his German ideology. He believed that industrial technology would free us from labor and allow us to be poets in the afternoon and writers in the evening. I've got friends like Albert Wenger, a venture capitalist in New York, who believes in something he calls a world after capital, where everyone will be free to realize themselves because of all this new technology. Everyone will be able to be a musician and a writer and a interviewer like Michael Krasny. I heard these promises after Web 2. They didn't come about. And I'm slightly skeptical that the same will happen. And of course, in the real world, all this new technology is just creating more and more inequality. We have companies like OpenAI that aren't even public, that are worth hundreds of billions of dollars. And small groups of people like Sam Altman are becoming enormously wealthy. And I'm not sure whether any of us are even experiencing what the Reagan people call a trickle down in this economy.
I'm also reminded, Andrew, of Jeremy Rifkin, who was trying to perhaps be somewhat of a Cassandra about how much work would be lost with the advent of the internet and all this technology. I don't know how familiar you were with Rifkin's work.
Yeah, I've had Rifkin on the show. I know him. We've spoken at conferences.
Credence in terms of what he was saying and still is saying?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure if anyone's attempted to quantify the jobs lost and created by the digital revolution. Certainly in media, the numbers are very concerning. I mean, you know this, again, Michael, better than I do. The digital revolution has decimated newspapers, the recording industry, writers, cinematographers. That doesn't mean that there still aren't industries, and you'll always have people say, oh, I can go on YouTube and there's this person with millions of followers who's making a wonderful income. There are always those outliers, but it's a winner-take-all economy. You have a few superstars on social media, but meanwhile, the creative middle class has been decimated. So I think if you were to quantify the consequences of the digital revolution in terms of jobs in the creative community, the news is actually extremely disturbing and becoming more and more disturbing with AI. And with the struggle for any creative person to make a living online. Now, the argument is, well, with AI, everyone can have their own music and cinematography without employing people, which may be true. But then all the profit goes to the software companies who were building the algorithms for AI-created music and cinematography, and not to the creative class itself.
That particularly rankles you, doesn't it?
Well, it does and it doesn't. I have to admit that I've got some new music for my podcast, which was created by AI, which I'm not such a music maven, but if I was to listen blind, I would think it was created by people. I see the upside, I see the potential, and I'm very irritated by people whose work doesn't really have any value. So I'm not a great fan of bureaucracies. I work very well on my own. I don't want to employ huge teams of people. I don't have the resources to employ huge groups of people for whom I'm not quite sure what their value is. So I see the upside, I see the potential. But the problem, it goes back to Web 2, and a lot of the arguments are still the same, is this was supposed to be liberating, supposed to create more labor, more value, more of a pure relationship between the creative class and their followers, their readers, their listeners, their viewers. I'm not sure that's really the case. And indeed, the Coppolas, the Scorseses are still around, still making traditional movies, but it's harder and harder to become a Coppola, a Scorsese, a Dylan these days. It's very hard to get a start. And a few do. Taylor Swift, of course, comes to mind, but they're superstars.
And Scorsese points out we're getting all these kind of futuristic and comic book movies and not movies that are telling stories like the movies that he made or Coppola made. I think this is something that really should give us some serious concern.
I mean, what do you think, Michael? I mean, you're on the front lines of this. You were in traditional radio. Now you have this startup show. Are you more or less optimistic about the potential for wannabe Michael Krasny's?
No, I'm not optimistic about that. I mean, in terms of what you're describing as generic Michael Krasny's, I mean, people who want to pursue, for example, on their own, a career in media and establish themselves. I'm doing a book, as I said, about interviewing, and what I'm struck by is just how much clickbait has taken over for those who can succeed on any level, especially an economic level. And that's really hurt what used to be traditional media and journalistic standards and continues to really in many ways. But I don't want to get in my homiletic a high horse here. I was just going to ask you, what's the responsibility of the technological companies which are making all this money off creativity, as you put it?
Well, again, my response is twofold. On the one hand, these are private companies, and I don't buy this business school utopianism that companies are the future of morality and that we should rely on them more than governments. The job of companies, private companies that is, private for-profit companies, is to make money. Doesn't make them bad, but it makes them for-profit companies. So I'm not sure we can expect too much from them. But as I argue in How to Fix the Future, I think entrepreneurs have a degree of moral responsibility. They shouldn't be pioneering technologies or companies that clearly are against the public interest. So I think somebody like Reid Hoffman has been very vocal. He's a wealthy man. I don't think he invests in things that he's disturbed with. So I think that this new generation of startup entrepreneurs need to be more mindful, certainly of the utopianism that went with the startup community in the Web 2.0 age. For example, Mark Zuckerberg said some really dumb things. I could have invented him, all the stuff about bringing the world closer together. I remember him saying at one point, I want the internet or the world to become like a well-lit dorm room, which of course is a very chilling suggestion. And he's contributed to that, where we're all being watched all the time. It's a digital version of the Panopticon, Jeremy Bentham's dystopian vision for the late 18th century. So I would hope that next generation Zuckerbergs are a little bit, I mean, he's a smart guy, a little bit more thoughtful and responsible and not just obsessed with making money. The money will come. And there's no reason why you can't make money and also have a degree of responsibility.
I must confess to you, I had a dream last night that Zuckerberg was asking me if he could do my podcast. Now, that may have had something to do with knowing that I was going to be interviewing you. I didn't know, honestly, how I wanted to respond to him, but he was sort of jockeying for a position on this podcast. Maybe
well, he's welcome. If he doesn't want to come on yours, if he's watching, Mark, you're more than welcome to come on Keen On. And what would you ask him, Michael, if he came on?
Actually, I had an interview with his sister on Forum on my radio program who had put a book out. It was actually a nice little book, and she seemed very thoughtful and sweet to me. But, you get into the kind of question I just asked you. What's the responsibility of you folks who are flying high? And I want to ask him some tough stuff about Burma, for example, Myanmar, and how Facebook affected the election and how young people are being bullied on social media and all of that sort of thing. What's his responsibilities?
Yeah, good friend of mine is Maria Ressa, who won the Nobel Peace Prize 2 or 3 years ago. And she's as well equipped as anyone to see what the damage Facebook is doing to a democracy in a country like the Philippines. And she is violently outspoken when it comes to Zuckerberg and Facebook's responsibility. I think she teaches now at Columbia, at Hillary Clinton's new institute. So I trust people like Maria, who used to work for CNN, who's an enormously honest and brave woman. And the impact of Facebook in countries like Myanmar and Philippines and many other countries around the world is profoundly disturbing. I agree with you.
Well, there's lots of questions for you. And here's Victoria from Dallas, right on point here. She said, what should Zuckerberg have done differently? Can Facebook recover?
Well, I think when you look at the stock market price of Facebook, it's actually doing quite well. So there's nothing to recover from. He took an unwise bet on virtual reality 3 or 4 years ago, believing that was the future. That seemed to have failed. And now he's betting like everybody else on AI and seems to be being quite successful. I don't remember the last time I looked at the stock, Facebook stock, but it's doing quite well. So I think in his mind, Facebook is doing reasonably well. If we're to second guess Zuckerberg and revise history, I think what he should have been more careful about is this utopian idea that connecting everyone is good for democracy. It triggered the Arab Spring, of course, but the Arab Spring was a failure. It triggered Occupy Wall Street. That seems to have been a failure. And digital networking doesn't create political foundations, and it also empowers the police, the secret police, just as everyone can see everybody else. So the secret police can observe everyone else, the Chinese or Myanmar or Filipino secret police. So I think what I would like people like Zuckerberg to do is be a little bit more, I won't say honest, because that's not their job. Their job is to make more money, but to be more circumspect and respectful of the vagaries of history and acknowledge that they don't really know the future and that they should be much more careful in the kind of promises that they offer. And I think the closest thing to a Zuckerberg today is Sam Altman at OpenAI. He's equally smart, equally dynamic, but in some ways equally utopian in the promises he's offering. On the other hand, he has acknowledged the damage that OpenAI and AI could do to humanity, to our business models, to media, to creativity. And he seems a little bit more committed to acknowledging that. So perhaps these dynamic young entrepreneurs of Silicon Valley have learned something from the disasters of Web 2.0.
One can hope. Here's Jerry from Aurora. Earlier, you mentioned something being somewhat sympathetic to college riots. Surely you don't mean chasing Jewish students and calling for the destruction of Israel.
Well, again, that's the kind of question, Michael, that I think sort of undermines how we talk to one another. I didn't say either of those things. In my view, U.S. support, unthinking U.S. support for Israel, which is a superpower in the Middle East, has been very disturbing. It's the first time since Vietnam that students have been particularly active, and I understand that. It's self-evident hypocrisy. On the one hand, they want to support the Ukrainians having been invaded by Russia. On the other hand, they're willing, it seems at least, to give the green light to Israel invading Gaza. So what did this person accuse me of?
I don't know if it was an accusation. It was phrased as an interrogatory.
Well, what did they say? That I was... I mean, one can be supportive of students demonstrating.
Well, he mentioned students being chased and violence against Jewish students.
In UCLA, they were chased by much more violent demonstrators. At Columbia, the police have been heavily criticized. I think the response often of the police in these student campus demonstrations has been irresponsible and often violent. And the UCLA case is particularly disturbing when the police turned a blind eye to the violent counter demonstrations that seemed like a sort of a ragtag Trumpian Make America Great army of people who came in and beat up these kids. So I celebrate I celebrate college students taking a very vocal role in criticizing American foreign policy. I don't see it as being particularly different from Vietnam. What I would say is that the digital culture has created a kind of clicktivist world where these students aren't taking the risks that the anti-Vietnam demonstrators did, some of them fleeing the country. So I think one of the problems with the digital revolution, as I said earlier, is that it hasn't resulted in long-term political change. It failed in the Middle East. It failed in the Arab Spring. It failed in Occupy. Even Black Lives Matter doesn't seem to have had a huge impact. So on the one hand, the internet seems to be a place of dynamic political debate and change. And yet, later this year, Michael, and this is where we started, two clearly over-the-hill 80-year-olds in two clearly dinosaur-like political parties will be fighting the American election. So we have two things going on simultaneously. On the one hand, politics isn't changing. And on the other hand, we have this place called the internet where people are shouting and screaming and believing that they're orchestrating change, but they're not. And they're connected in an odd kind of way.
Political question. Do you see an analogy or a parallel between, for example, the Viet Cong and Hamas?
Again, that's a leading question. I certainly...
Well, you'd made the analogy to Vietnam earlier, so it's a natural question to follow.
Well, put it like this. You have to be careful here, because otherwise someone will come bomb my house, assassinate me. But I would argue that the Hamas is more like the Viet Cong than the Nazis. It doesn't mean that they're like the Viet Cong, but they're closer to being like the Viet Cong than the Nazis. And I'm sure in the 60s, I'm not a great scholar of the Vietnam conflict, but I'm sure the media in the 60s, especially in the early 60s, had all sorts of stories about the murderous behavior of the Viet Cong, which probably was true. I'm not trying to excuse them or, for that matter, Hamas, which justified, vindicated the behavior of the state. I mean, this isn't new. I think what came out of 9/11 was catastrophic as well. The two wars in the Middle East, particularly the invasion of Iraq, were consequences of 9/11, which ultimately have weakened and undermined not just democracy, but America's role in the world. So I think we tend to overreact to these kinds of violent activities, whether it's Al-Qaeda or Hamas, or for that matter, the Viet Cong.
Overreact to what happened on 9/11? Or overreact to Hamas having in its...
I don't think, well, 9/11, the murder of 1,500 people in New York didn't justify two catastrophically expensive Middle Eastern wars, which undermined the region, lost thousands, tens of thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq and Afghanistan, and has ultimately created a region which is even more unstable and violent than it was 25 years ago. And the behavior of Hamas, I don't believe, on December 7th, doesn't justify an invasion of Gaza, which resulted in 30,000+ dead Palestinians. So no, I don't think either. It doesn't excuse what happened, but you can't have this uncontrolled response where any response to some sort of terrorist act or violent act gives you carte blanche to do whatever you like. And I think the American response is that Israel is a junior partner. It's a less powerful country. And historically, junior partners do what the senior partners tell them. And the problem is when those junior partners become so politically smart or determined that they're uncontrollable, that's when catastrophes happen. I think the closest equivalent are the behavior of the Serbian terrorists before the First World War. They were uncontrolled by their supposed Russian masters, and that resulted in the catastrophe of the First World War, of tens of millions of dead people. So I think it's the responsibility of senior partners, the US or Russia with Serbia, the US with Israel, to control these countries and make them behave more responsibly. So my criticism is more of the Biden administration than of Israel.
I understand, and your criticism is of the overreaction. But I wonder, when I think about the lack of reaction of what's going on in Sudan or what went on in Syria, I don't know who the managing partners are there, but there was just lack of interest throughout in terms of comparing it to what's going on now.
Again, firstly, on the Syrian thing, it was a civil war, which was orchestrated by the Russians. I mean, America could have been involved. It was kind of involved. But they don't have as much ability to control it. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, I agree. I'm not a defender of the Saudi regime. But again, it's this sort of moral false equivalence that you can't be critical of one thing, whether it's Israeli behavior in Gaza, because you're not critical of what happened in Syria or Saudi Arabia or Sudan.
No, I wasn't implying that, Andrew. What I was saying was, who's the master in the paradigm that you offered? Where was the kind of muscle, if you will, with respect to what was going on in Yemen? It just wasn't there.
Well, then there's nothing you can do. Then it becomes a moot point, because you can't control events on the ground in Yemen or Syria or Sudan because you're not a major power. But if you can control stuff, as the Americans should be able to control their junior partners, the Israelis, then they should do so. And they say all this stuff, but they don't actually accomplish anything. Now, whether it's because they don't really want to, or because Biden is a tired old man who hasn't the ability to really stand up to Netanyahu, is an open question. But it's very disturbing to me, and that's why I understand the anger of college students. Now, I don't take the view that there's a genocide, and that's the G word. That's another issue. But I do think America, if it's claiming to be the world's moral policeman, which was a discourse that has been developed since Wilson over the last 100 years, if it really does claim to be the world's moral policeman, then its unwillingness to challenge what Israel is doing in Gaza is very troubling. It's upset a generation of students. And like American involvement in Vietnam, I think it's ultimately going to be very disturbing for not just the reputation of the country, America, in the world, but also in the relations between young Americans and the state.
Well, you talk about the misuse of the word genocide. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about what's in Hamas's charter, which is essentially genocide against Israel and against the Jews.
Yeah, you probably could have found the same charter in Al-Qaeda or in the Black Hand, the Bosnian terrorist group. All these terrorist groups say something, but they can't really do very much. They behaved extremely badly when they, obviously in last year. But just because, whether or not they formally claim genocide or eliminating the Jewish people is neither here nor there. They can want to, they can't. And Israel is a highly militarized superpower, a nuclear power, militarily massively dominant over all its neighbors. So whatever Hamas says or does is neither here nor there.
Oh, we've got lots of questions for you. Let me go back to them. We've got Frank from Orlando, Florida, who wants to know, how can people navigate the challenges of privacy in an increasingly digital world? Thank you, Frank.
That's a good question, Frank. I have to admit, personally, I'm less concerned. I don't do anything bad online. I don't even look at pornography, so I've got nothing to be ashamed of. And I'm not too concerned. On the other hand, there seems to be an awful lot of fraud online, a lot of emails trying to get your data. I think people just need to understand that when they publish online, they're revealing themselves. So when they post a lot on Facebook or on X, these companies don't charge you to participate in their platform. And they're making money from what you say and do. So when you're followed around online with adverts from stuff you've bought, when you're a little too closely wedded to Google. I'm married to a Google executive, so I'm all too familiar with being too closely wedded to Google. You have to acknowledge the consequences of your behavior. And if you care about this kind of stuff, if you care about being watched and followed, then don't go on these platforms. I use Apple email, for example. And if anyone wants to email me, I'm a.keen@me.com. I choose Apple over Google because Apple doesn't sell advertising. Now, Apple is not an ideal company. I'm questioning particularly their behavior in China. But on the other hand, their business model is mostly in selling software and hardware. So you pay for an iPhone or an iPad or a MacBook computer, and you pay for Apple app services. And that means that I can trust Apple email not to be somehow aggregating my data as Google seems to do with Gmail, so that you get advertising that chillingly reflects what you might be emailing or the kinds of emails. So we all have to be, it comes back to agency. It comes back to Thomas More. We need to be accountable. We can't be children. We like to be children. We like to have everything and not have responsibilities. But just as moral responsibility comes with running a company like Facebook or OpenAI, being an online user also comes with moral responsibility. And particularly if we're parents or teachers, we have, I think, a responsibility to educate our kids in what they should and shouldn't do. And particularly I was always very disturbed with, in the early days of Facebook, all these people of my generation, they'd all post all these photos of their babies and kids. And now the babies and kids have grown up and they're very uncomfortable. So we need to be much more careful about what we reveal. I'm a rather secretive person. You can find me online, but you can't really find much out about myself, about my friends, my family, my kids. And I choose it to be that way. And I think some people might disagree. That's fine. But you have to understand that we're all accountable, and there are consequences of revealing everything about ourselves online. And if we do reveal everything about ourselves, then some of those consequences are going to be quite chilling.
Now you think about all those kids who are applying for jobs now and have the pictures of wild behavior as college students.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and everybody now, employers, the first thing they'll do is go to Google and do a search on these people. And you hear more and more stories of people not getting jobs because of the way they behave. Can
we talk about Google for a minute, Andrew? I'm interested.
Of course, yeah. Although my wife will probably shut us down. She's head of litigation there. So she's the senior policewoman. You don't want to be getting a call from her.
I don't even know if this question in your household would be entertained, but I was wondering about do no evil because last time I had conversation with Eric Schmidt, which was very animated, I might add, it was about Google doing evil, and he became very protective and defensive about that, as he is wont to do, I think, and pretty much tried to sort of put it on its head, so to speak.
What do you mean, put it on its head?
No, I mean, just dispense with it. We don't do any evil.
Yeah, I mean, I think that do no evil phrase was created, I think, again, in retrospect, they would choose not to use that. It was created by engineers in the early years of Google. I think they've moved away from that.
But they know everything about everybody, and they have access to all that.
Well, they do and they don't. It's not as if they're watching your and my email. I mean, one thing you can do is I use Google as a search engine, but I don't sign in. I don't use Gmail. People have to understand that Google doesn't just own Gmail and the search engine, they also own YouTube. So they're trying to create a kind of an architecture of surveillance. They're an advertising company, a massively successful one. I don't think they're really interested in knowing us, Michael. They're just interested in profiting from us. They are a chilling company. I will acknowledge that publicly. But I think...
I used to tell my listeners there are other search engines out there.
Yeah, there are. But, that goes back to accountability and agency. There have been other search engines for years. There's one called DuckDuckGo, which was venture-backed by Union Square Ventures. Every time there's a scandal with Google, a few 100,000 people join DuckDuckGo, but they're not viable. The interesting thing is with AI, you're going to have new search engines. You already have an AI one called Perplexity. but one wonders whether the architecture of surveillance will be any different. Google is also, like Microsoft was trying to do in the 90s, which was on the one hand, hang on to its desktop publishing monopoly, and on the other hand, transform itself in an internet company. Google is on the one hand, hanging on to its dominance in search. It's still, I don't know, in Europe, 95% of search. It's a monopoly really in search. And reinvent itself as an AI company. So it's going to be interesting to see how Google achieves that. One of the troubling things, by the way, of the AI revolution is in the early days of Web 2.0, at least there were startups. I mean, Google was the first Web 2.0 company. It was a real startup, and it challenged Microsoft, which was the big tech company of its age. The problem today in the AI revolution is that the AI startups aren't really startups. I mean, they're either companies like Google or Microsoft, or companies like OpenAI, which are supported by Microsoft and have valuations of hundreds of billions of dollars. So we've lost the startup spirit in this new AI economy.
We don't have a lot of time left, but we've got a lot of questions, especially about AI, so maybe we can turn those over. I wanted to ask you about your interview with the North Carolina professor about 1,000 years of Native American history. I don't think we're going to have time for that. Maybe another.
Well, people have to, that's my segue, Michael, to toot my own horn. People should go to Keen On and subscribe, and I'd appreciate suggestions of good guests. That woman, Kathleen Duval, wrote a wonderful 1,000-year history of the native peoples of America. It's a wonderful book, and it's an excellent conversation. She was a delightful guest. You should get her on your show.
I have not read the book, but I enjoyed the conversation, and it's something that interested me, and I thank you for that. But I wanted to go to these questions that are looming here. What happens, Kevin from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania wants to know, thank you, Kevin, when we become dependent on AI and then AI gets worse, feeding on itself, or is disrupted from war impacting our communication network or massive natural disaster like a solar storm, will we be helpless?
Well, that's the existential question. I think the reality of AI is that Google was the first AI company. The reason why its search engine was so successful is because it was an AI product. In the old days, in the 90s, Yahoo employed real people, librarians, to sit in caravans on the Stanford campus to create a kind of online library. Google's algorithm transforms search into an AI product. So we've had AI around for 25 years. Maybe it wasn't always called AI. I think, though, the questions that Kevin brings up are really relevant. I'm not apocalyptic in the sense that I believe that these AIs will learn to think for themselves and the will become footnotes. Someone wrote a book saying AI would be our last invention because after that we'd become subservient to these AIs. I still think we're in the fairly early stages, and the latest version of OpenAI, for example, I haven't been particularly impressed with. There's a lot of hype, a lot of media stuff. But in the long run, we are creating an architecture of artificial intelligence that will run everything from our politics to our economics to our personal lives. And it's deeply concerning. And I think that is the narrative of the 21st century. We might be preoccupied with Trump or Putin or Ukraine or Gaza. But when historians look back at the 21st century, they will see this. Smart machines replacing humans or challenging humans, and how we're going to be able to work with these smart machines as the critical narrative of our age.
I keep you for a few more minutes?
Of course, more than welcome. That's the beauty of the internet.
I know.
We can go on forever.
We've got questions which I would like to have you address from our thoughtful listeners, and this is Tom in Boulder, Colorado, who says, again, talking about AI, with the expansion of AI, will people long and eventually demand human-only networks?
I think so, absolutely. I think that's a good business idea. Someone should develop that. You remember with digital on music, when MP3.com came along, everyone was buying CDs. Vinyl was dead. And in the 25 years since then, CD is now the one that's dead. Everyone's embraced vinyl. Vinyl now is a bigger selling medium than CD. So we have a lot of free music. We have a lot of poor quality digital music. But vinyl has reappeared, and young people now are embracing the quality, the physicality of analog. And I think it's absolutely true. I think there'll be a low end of digital networks, of digital communities, and privilege, power will lie in the physical. It's done that with arts. It's done it with the reappearance of the cult of handwriting, perhaps in education as well. The problem with digital is it lends itself to low cost, bad quality products. So online education, online music, generally tends to be of a lower quality. So there's a lot of free online information, but if you want to get reliable information, you have to pay for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. And I think the same will be true of physical. I think for people longing for physical community, that will become a kind of weird analog business model. I think someone wrote a book, I had them on my show, The Return of Analog or The Revenge of Analog. And I think that will play itself out in all sorts of interesting ways in the 21st century.
I think it's inevitable.
Yeah, and not necessarily. The problem is it's nice to have the choice. The problem is the disappearance of the middle. The problem is that it's an either or, and it will tend to reflect people's power and privilege. So my fear is that digital will be free, it will be unreliable, it will be the fast food, if you like, of our information age. And we've got, of course, many expensive restaurants in San Francisco. Michael, I'm sure you enjoy them as much as I do, but there's very little in between. There's no middle class in San Francisco, and we see the disappearance, not just because of technology, but that's a feature of so much of contemporary America.
2 more questions. Let me get to them. Peter, thank you for yours. Peter's up in Boise, Idaho, and he wants to know, did social media really accelerate the Arab Spring, or was it more connected to Al Jazeera creating the feedback loop? Do we give social media more credit than it deserves?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I didn't want to give the impression that social media created the Arab Spring. I think he's right. The reverse is actually true. It was perceived, though, in Silicon Valley that the Arab Spring was caused by social media. And there were lots
they were trying to take credit for it, weren't they?
Yeah, they were trying to take credit, and there were lots of writers. I mean, even my friend David Kirkpatrick now has become a great critic of Facebook. He wrote the first really authoritative book on Facebook, and he begins with all these developments in North Africa and the Middle East. He's turned against that now. So I think, yeah, absolutely. I don't think that social media was critical, although I've done a number of shows. There's one with a friend of mine, Ece Temelkuran, a Turkish activist, and she talks about the importance of social media as
a force against Erdogan, because it is.
Well, no, and more as a sort of as an enabler of organization for Tahrir Square and for the other demonstrations. So at first, it helped the demonstrators, but it didn't get caused. I mean, we could go back to the greatest uprising of the late 20th century was the Polish uprising against the Russians under Solidarity. And that was all accomplished by the printing press. So I think we tend to exaggerate the importance of technology, and particularly the people who own technology like to take credit. So I think that's right. And I didn't want to give the impression that social media created the Arab Spring. It was perceived to create it. But of course, it was caused by much more deep-lying, profound socioeconomic and political.
Well, that was the penultimate question. Let me now give you the final question here from Jake in Los Angeles, who wants to know, should TikTok be banned, and what role, if any, should the U.S. government play?
It's a good question. I strongly feel that TikTok shouldn't be banned. I see no reason to ban TikTok as opposed to Facebook or Twitter or X or any of these other social networks. I'm a globalist. I'm deeply disturbed by the success Trump seems to have had of turning Biden against the Chinese. There's absolutely no reason to shut down TikTok because it's Chinese owned. Firstly, quote unquote Chinese owned is meaningless. China has its own entrepreneurial infrastructure. It's not as if
they have all our data, though, Andrew. That's the argument, isn't it?
Well, they have all our data. I don't think they do have. What are data? Because we're on TikTok? What does that mean? Again, you have to be very careful, Michael. That's paranoia. They do and they don't. I see no reason to shut TikTok down. Or if you want to shut TikTok down because to borrow your language, they have all our data. They, who is that? The American government, entrepreneurs, the Chinese? I don't buy it. I think China has many other things to do than aggregate data through TikTok. So I'm strongly against any regulation against TikTok that's different from regulating Facebook or Instagram. And it's no surprise that it's our friend Mark Zuckerberg and his associates at Facebook and Instagram who seem to be encouraging the American government to shut TikTok down. I don't like TikTok any more than I like Instagram or Facebook, but I think we're going to shut TikTok down. We should shut the whole lot down, and I'm against shutting anything down. I'm not an aggressive regulator. I don't believe in censorship.
The paranoid argument that they're influencing our youth, of course, or all those other platforms, obviously.
Well, they're not influencing our youth. That's, again, paranoia, Michael. TikTok is a place of short form video where kids put stuff up. To me, it's inane and annoying. I'm not on it. But there's no hand of the Chinese Communist Party behind it. It's just complete paranoia. It's not true.
Well, let me first give my thanks to all who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and all who will be joining us on Apple, Spotify, and on our website at graymatter.show. And if you haven't yet become a member of this podcast, again, I invite you to join us by going to our website at graymatter.show, where you can find any previous episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to email any of your reactions, thoughts, or recommendations to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And I want to extend thanks to the great Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Colin, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya. And a special thanks to this week's guest, Andrew Keene. I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.